In the late summer of 1943, deep within the arid, sun-baked plains of Texas, American military guards patrolled the perimeter of a highly unusual internment camp. Behind the barbed wire sat an unexpected group of detainees, Italian women. They were former military nurses and auxiliary staff, captured thousands of miles away during the North African campaign. Officially classified as enemy prisoners of war, they were stranded in an alien desert, locked in a tense standoff with armed captors who viewed them as active enemies. But as August brought faint whispers of secret diplomatic back-channels in Europe, this isolated facility was about to become the testing ground for an impossible administrative experiment. The formal Italian armistice of September 1943 triggered an unprecedented bureaucratic nightmare for the U.S. War Department. The moment the surrender was broadcast, the geopolitical map fractured. Overnight, the Italian military apparatus theoretically transformed from a fascist-aligned adversary into a required co-belligerent alongside the Allies. Yet, for the Italian auxiliary personnel sweating behind barbed wire in the American South, this sudden diplomatic pivot meant absolute legal paralysis. The 1929 Geneva Convention offered no clear framework for hostile detainees who abruptly switched sides while still locked inside American stockades. Texas camp commanders were left holding bewildered, exhausted personnel with no official protocol on how to legally classify them. They could not be repatriated, but treating them as hostile prisoners of war was no longer politically viable. The atmosphere inside the compounds grew volatile, as both guards and detainees realized the established rules of engagement had simply vanished. How did the United States military manage this explosive legal vacuum? This is the documented history of how one isolated internment facility diffused a potential standoff, not with machine guns, but through strict logistics, organized labor, and the careful administration of daily rations. How did the rigid, unforgiving mechanics of a Texas prison camp force bitter enemies to forge a tense, uneasy coexistence out of sheer administrative necessity? By the late spring of 1943, the Allied victory in the Mediterranean theater had triggered a massive and immediate logistical crisis. The complete collapse of Axis forces in North Africa dumped approximately 275,000 prisoners into Allied hands in a matter of weeks. Holding them in Europe or North Africa was mathematically impossible. Every pound of food, every gallon of aviation fuel, and every square foot of secure space was desperately needed for the impending invasion of Sicily and the Italian mainland. The War Department devised a practical, if unprecedented, solution to clear the battlefield. Dozens of Liberty ships, having just delivered troops and heavy munitions to the front, were sitting empty for their return voyage across the Atlantic. The United States military began loading these hollow steel hulls with tens of thousands of captured Axis personnel, effectively outsourcing the prisoner of war problem to the American homeland. Most of these detainees were seasoned combat infantry, tank crews, and artillerymen of the Africa Corps and the Italian Eighth Army. But mixed within the sprawling manifests of the defeated armies was an administrative anomaly that the United States military was not legally or culturally prepared to handle. Italian female auxiliary personnel. These were military nurses, administrative clerks, and hospital staff who had been embedded deep within the Italian logistics chain across Libya and Tunisia. Their presence immediately created legal friction. The 1929 Geneva Convention offered detailed, rigid instructions for handling armed combatants, but its definitions regarding uniformed female non-combatants integrated into a military command structure were dangerously vague. Were they civilian internees? Were they protected medical personnel? Or were they active military prisoners of war, subject to the same physical restrictions as frontline soldiers? Not wanting to waste precious time litigating international law on an active beachhead, American field commanders made a blunt, pragmatic calculation. The women wore the uniform of a hostile power. They were processed as enemy combatants and loaded onto the transport ships. After weeks in the sweltering, cramped holds of naval convoys, dodging U-boats in the Atlantic, the female detainees arrived on the east coast of the United States. From there, they were loaded onto heavily guarded trains with blacked-out windows and sent deep into the American interior. Their destination was Texas. The War Department had deliberately selected the vast, arid plains of the American Southwest for its primary prisoner of war installations. The terrain itself acted as a secondary prison wall, a hostile environment of heat and dust that made escape virtually impossible. For the Italian women stepping off the trains in the blistering heat of August 1943, the psychological shock was absolute. They had been violently extracted from the familiar Mediterranean landscape and dropped into an alien, unforgiving desert. The facility that awaited them was not a hospital, nor was it a civilian internment center. It was a standard-issue military stockade, constructed with rigid geometry, surrounded by high barbed wire fences, and watched by armed men manning elevated guard towers. Inside the wire, the camp was managed with suffocating precision. The American base commanders operated strictly by the manual, treating the female compound with the same heavy-handed security protocols applied to regular infantry officers. Daily roll calls, mandatory barracks inspections, and highly regulated meal schedules were enforced without exception. But the true tension within the camp was not born from the rulebook. It was born from the men tasked with enforcing it. The American military policemen and garrison troops assigned to guard the Italian auxiliaries were not neutral, detached observers. Many were men who had been cycled out of active duty due to injury, or soldiers who had already lost brothers and friends to Italian and German artillery fire in the mountain passes of North Africa. To these American guards, the women in the compound were not innocent medics or neutral bystanders caught in the crossfire. They were active, uniformed representatives of Benito Mussolini's fascist state. They were the enemy. Consequently, they were treated with the cold, rigid hostility reserved for a hostile force. On the other side of the wire, the Italian women harbored an equally intense bitterness. From their perspective, the Americans were a brutal, occupying force, the same military machine that was currently bombing their homeland cities into rubble. Every interaction between the detainees and the guards was heavily scrutinized and fraught with suspicion. Language barriers only amplified the paranoia. Simple administrative tasks, like the distribution of basic hygiene supplies, the coordination of camp laundry, or the rationing of food, were conducted with the tense, silent standoff of a battlefield negotiation. The American commanders expected defiance, sabotage, and subversion, constantly monitoring the women's barracks for any sign of organized resistance. The Italian personnel, stripped of their ranks and professional dignity, responded with cold non-compliance, relying on their internal military discipline to maintain order among themselves and pushing back against their captors wherever the rules allowed. It was a highly combustible environment, defined by deep mutual hatred, bound together only by the unforgiving steel wire of the Texas stockade. Throughout the tense weeks of late August 1943, the camp operated strictly by the book, preparing for a prolonged, multi-year war of attrition against a determined enemy. It was a perfectly calibrated system of containment, and it remained that way right up until a single, static-filled radio broadcast from Europe shattered the entire administrative reality overnight. That broadcast came on September 8, 1943, when General Dwight D. Eisenhower publicly announced the armistice of Cassabile. The Italian government had unconditionally surrendered, and all hostilities between the armed forces of Italy and the Allied nations were to cease immediately. In Texas, camp commanders who had spent weeks running a rigid, maximum security detention center suddenly found themselves staring at a legal impossibility. Within hours, the teletype machines at the camp headquarters began churning out frantic, contradictory directives from the War Department in Washington. The official status of the hundreds of Italian women sitting inside the wire had just been annihilated. They were no longer the enemy, but, strictly speaking, they were not trusted allies either. The geopolitical reality had completely outpaced international law. By surrendering and subsequently aligning against Nazi Germany, Italy had become a co-belligerent. It was a vague, poorly defined diplomatic status that left the American military bureaucracy paralyzed. The War Department ordered the local camp administrations to immediately alter their treatment of the Italian auxiliaries. The hostile, punitive security measures were to be suspended. Instead, the detainees were to be reorganized under a rapidly devised framework known as the Italian Service Units Program. The theory drafted by Pentagon bureaucrats was straightforward. The former prisoners would volunteer to work alongside the American military to support the Allied logistics network, effectively freeing up American personnel for combat duty overseas. In exchange, the Italians would receive better living conditions, modest wages, and a significant relaxation of security protocols. It was an elegant bureaucratic solution on paper, but on the isolated, dust-choked grounds of the Texas stockade, it was an absolute powder keg. The War Department was demanding an instant, mandatory psychological pivot. The American guards, many of whom harbored deep, personal grief and hatred directed at the Axis powers, were ordered to immediately stop treating the Italian women as dangerous fascists and start treating them as vital logistical partners. Simultaneously, the Italian personnel, who had spent the last month enduring what they viewed as a brutal, humiliating American captivity, were suddenly expected to swear cooperation to their captors and volunteer their labor to aid the United States war machine. Neither side was remotely prepared for this abrupt transition. The mandate from Washington was explicit: drop all hostility, dismantle the rigid prisoner of war protocols, and begin immediate cooperation. But administrative decrees cannot instantly erase deeply ingrained wartime resentment. The camp command now faced an unprecedented crisis of human management, forcing embittered American guards and deeply distrustful, displaced Italian auxiliaries into this new, ill-defined, co-belligerent status meant stripping away the clear, reliable rules of a prison stockade. The War Department demanded immediate cooperation on paper, but executing that order and forcing these two profoundly hostile factions to actually work side by side under the Texas sun would prove to be a logistical and psychological nightmare. The implementation of the newly drafted Italian service units was not an exercise in diplomatic goodwill. It was a blunt, highly calculated instrument of logistical extraction. By the autumn of 1943, the American home front was facing a severe manpower crisis. The relentless demands of the Pacific and European theaters had systematically hollowed out the domestic workforce, stripping rural Texas of its able-bodied men. Local agricultural sectors were on the brink of collapse, with massive yields of cotton, peanuts, and sorghum threatening to rot in the vast, sun-baked fields. Simultaneously, the sprawling military infrastructure of the Southwest required a small army of personnel just to maintain base operations, run the industrial laundries, and manage the supply depots. The War Department looked at the thousands of Italian detainees sitting idle behind barbed wire and saw an immediate, mathematically perfect solution. The female Italian auxiliary personnel, formerly medical staff and administrative clerks of a hostile army, were rapidly reorganized into mandatory work details. The transition was brutal in its efficiency. Stripped of their former military dignity, the women were pushed into highly regimented labor quotas that had nothing to do with their previous medical training. They were assigned to the grueling, repetitive tasks required to keep both the military installations and the local civilian economy functioning. From dawn until dusk, under the suffocating heat of the Texas sun, they were marched out to operate heavy industrial laundry machinery, scrub barracks, and, most exhaustingly, harvest crops in the endless, dusty fields of the American Southwest. The work was physically devastating. The United States military was not running a rehabilitation program. They were running a massive labor extraction operation, and the Italian women were expected to deliver strict, daily quotas of physical output. However, the War Department's neat bureaucratic redesign fundamentally ignored the explosive political reality festering inside the barracks. The September armistice had not magically erased years of deeply ingrained ideological conditioning. Behind the wire, the Italian compounds rapidly fractured into a bitter, highly volatile civil war. A significant vocal faction of hardcore fascist loyalists utterly rejected the surrender of the Italian king. To these hardliners, who aligned themselves with Benito Mussolini's newly formed, German-backed Salo Republic, the armistice was an act of ultimate, unforgivable treason. This ideological schism turned the prison camp into a deeply dangerous environment. The women who chose to sign the American cooperation agreements and join the Italian service units were immediately branded as traitors and collaborators by the fascist faction. Inside the cramped, unair-conditioned wooden barracks, the tension became suffocating. The hardliners initiated a relentless campaign of psychological intimidation and coercion, whispered threats in the dark, the systemic isolation of cooperators, and the sabotage of personal belongings became daily occurrences. The fascist loyalists actively attempted to disrupt the American labor quotas by intimidating the volunteers, creating an atmosphere of deep paranoia. The camp was no longer just a prison, holding a unified enemy. It was a sealed pressure cooker containing two warring ideological factions, bound together by the same chain-link fences. For the American military policemen and garrison troops guarding the perimeter, this internal fracture represented a logistical nightmare. The guards were already stretched to their absolute breaking point. They were tasked with the exhausting duty of escorting hundreds of detainees out into the vast, open Texas fields, ensuring no one escaped into the harsh terrain and enforcing strict agricultural harvest quotas. Now, they simultaneously had to act as riot police, constantly monitoring the internal dynamics of the work details to prevent the fascist hardliners from violently turning on the cooperators. The American base commanders found themselves trapped in a paradox. They were mandated by Washington to treat the cooperating Italian women as vital logistical partners, yet they had to maintain maximum security protocols to suppress the very real threat of an internal camp uprising. The guards, sweating through their uniforms in the unforgiving southern heat, struggled to police a foreign political conflict they barely understood. Language barriers made it nearly impossible for the Americans to identify the ringleaders of the fascist intimidation campaigns. The entire labor system was fraying at the edges. The friction of the Texas climate, the sheer physical exhaustion of the work, and the constant, simmering threat of internal political violence threatened to bring the agricultural extraction program to a grinding, catastrophic halt. The crisis forced a rapid, pragmatic recalculation at the highest levels of the camp administration. The base commanders and quartermasters realized that a malnourished, deeply fractured, and physically exhausted workforce could not harvest cotton or maintain a military base. To prevent the complete collapse of the Italian service units, the administration recognized they needed to alter the fundamental variables of the camp's daily life. The intervention they engineered was not driven by humanitarian concern. It was a matter of strict caloric mathematics. Prior to the armistice, the Italian detainees had been fed on standard, heavily restricted prisoner of war rations. The portions were designed strictly for containment, not for fueling 10-hour shifts of hard manual labor in a hostile climate. The American quartermasters abruptly shifted the logistical pipeline. To ease the soaring hostility and ensure the work details remained physically capable of meeting their quotas, the military began pushing massive quantities of standard, high-calorie United States agricultural and military rations directly into the Italian compounds. The loading docks of the camps were suddenly flooded with the rigid, industrialized output of the American wartime supply chain. The quartermasters delivered vast crates of Spam, heavily processed canned meats, giant tins of dehydrated eggs, powdered milk, surplus cornmeal, and massive sacks of refined white flour. It was an overwhelming influx of calories, scientifically calculated by the War Department to sustain heavy physical exertion. The United States military was literally attempting to fuel the peace and buy compliance through the sheer volume of daily caloric intake. But for the Italian auxiliary personnel, this sudden abundance of American military food presented a new, deeply jarring challenge. The rations were culturally alien, highly processed, and, to the Mediterranean palate, often completely unpalatable. Yet, the brutal reality of their situation left no room for culinary preference. After enduring grueling, deeply physical labor in the scorching fields, the women were starving. Their bodies desperately required the heavy calories the Americans were providing. Out of sheer, uncompromising necessity, the Italian detainees were forced to adapt. They could not change the raw materials provided by the American quartermasters, but they could change how those materials were processed. Drawing on their internal discipline and desperate for any semblance of normalcy, the women took absolute control of the camp kitchens. They began a highly organized, pragmatic campaign to modify the strict military rations. The processed canned meats were aggressively boiled down, reseasoned, and integrated into complex, slow-cooked stews designed to mask the metallic taste of the military-issue tins. The surplus cornmeal was meticulously repurposed into dense, heavy polentas that could sustain a worker through a long afternoon in the laundry facilities. More importantly, The women began to aggressively supplement the rigid army diet with whatever they could extract from the local Texas environment. This required navigating the very guards who stood watch over them with loaded rifles. When the work details were marched out to the agricultural fields, the women began foraging for local wild herbs, wild onions, and native greens that grew along the irrigation ditches. They initiated a quiet, highly cautious barter system through the chain link fences. Using whatever meager resources they had, intricate needlework, repaired uniforms, or simply the leverage of their assigned labor, they traded with sympathetic or simply indifferent local farmers and American guards for cheap, abundant Texas ingredients. Fresh jalapenos, local garlic, heavily bruised tomatoes, and regional spices slowly began to find their way into the Italian barracks. This was not a romantic exchange of recipes. It was a desperate, calculated mechanism of survival. By forcing the rigid American supply chain to bend to their culinary methods, the Italian women were reclaiming a microscopic fraction of autonomy in an environment designed to strip them of all control. They used the heavy spices and local Texas heat to forcefully re-engineer the powdered eggs and canned meats into highly dense, flavorful rations that allowed them to physically endure the punishing labor quotas without losing their minds to the monotony of the stockade. However, this daily, relentless process of culinary adaptation inadvertently triggered a profound shift in the fundamental mechanics of the camp. Managing this complex, hybridized food supply required intense, daily logistical coordination. The Italian women running the mess halls could not operate in isolation. They had to constantly interface with the American quartermasters to secure access to the industrial ovens, coordinate the delivery schedules of the bulk flour, and negotiate the inventory of the modified rations. This forced, highly structured interaction over the logistics of the kitchen accomplished what the War Department's political decrees could not. It mandated communication. The deep, hostile silence that had defined the initial weeks of captivity was slowly ground down by the sheer, repetitive friction of daily administrative tasks. The language barrier began to fracture, not over complex diplomatic negotiations, but over the practical, localized vocabulary of weights, measures, temperatures, and supply manifests. The American supply sergeants and the Italian cooks had to understand each other to keep the camp functioning. Over the long, grueling months, this constant logistical overlap initiated a gradual, irreversible shift in the camp's atmosphere. The American guards, initially primed to view the women strictly as hostile fascist agents, slowly began to perceive them as highly efficient, indispensable components of the base's daily operation. The guards tasted the modified rations, witnessed the grueling work ethic in the fields, and engaged in the quiet, daily barter at the perimeter wire. Simultaneously, the cooperating Italian women, recognizing that their physical survival depended entirely on the reliability of the American supply chain, began to view the quartermasters not as brutal captors, but as necessary, transactional partners. On the surface, this slow transition presented the illusion of a heartwarming cultural exchange, a story of bitter enemies finding common ground over shared labor and adapted food. But the declassified administrative records of the Texas camps reveal a much colder, highly bureaucratic reality behind the scenes. The United States military meticulously tracked this stabilization. Every extra pound of flour, every adjusted work schedule, and every decrease in internal camp violence was quantified and logged in monthly efficiency reports sent back to Washington. The War Department did not view the shared kitchens as a triumph of human empathy. They viewed it as a successful optimization of a hostile labor force. The uneasy peace forged in the Texas desert was not built on forgiveness or mutual understanding. It was a cold, highly calibrated standoff, engineered by military quartermasters, sustained by strict caloric mathematics, and held together by the unforgiving, shared necessity of surviving the brutal American logistics machine. While the stabilization of the mess halls and the cotton fields registered as a logistical triumph in Washington, the reality on the ground was far darker. The United States government had not engineered this cooperative labor program out of humanitarian concern or a sudden wave of diplomatic goodwill. It was a cold, calculated strategy of manpower substitution. The War Department was running a relentless military calculus. Every Italian auxiliary scrubbing a base hospital or harvesting a Texas field freed an American GI to be armed and shipped to the European front. But as the women fulfilled their grueling end of the co-belligerent bargain, Washington deliberately stalled on its obligations. The legal status of the female auxiliaries remained intentionally unresolved by the Pentagon. By formally agreeing to the Italian Service Units program, the women had effectively surrendered their classification as enemy prisoners of war. However, they soon discovered the trap hidden in the paperwork. Stripped of their POW status, they simultaneously lost the strict protections and international oversight guaranteed by the 1929 Geneva Convention. Yet, as co-belligerents, the United States government refused to grant them the rights of Allied military personnel or civilian refugees. They were caught in an exploitative, bureaucratic loophole. The women were trapped as indefinite, unpaid wards of a shifting American foreign policy. There were no formal tribunals to hear their cases, no neutral Red Cross inspections to secure their rights, and, most devastatingly, no guaranteed repatriation dates. The psychological toll of this realization began to crush the camp's morale. The Italian personnel slowly understood that their exhausting daily labor was not buying their freedom, nor was it earning them legal protection. It was merely subsidizing their own endless captivity. This fragile, improvised system of exploited agricultural labor and caloric mathematics managed to hold together through the mild Texas autumn. The relentless daily routine provided a deceptive illusion of stability behind the barbed wire. But this administrative house of cards was fundamentally unstable, and as the seasons slowly began to turn, the entire framework was hurtling toward a severe, inevitable stress test. That inevitable stress test arrived with brutal suddenness in the opening weeks of 1944. A severe winter weather system slammed into the American Southwest, driving temperatures below freezing and exposing the structural fatalism of the Texas installations. The thin-walled, uninsulated pine barracks, designed strictly to shed summer heat, now trapped the biting cold, transforming the women's quarters into refrigerated wooden boxes. At the exact same moment, a massive wartime rail bottleneck paralyzed regional freight networks. External military supply shipments into the isolated facility plummeted, and the calorically dense rations that had fueled the co-belligerent labor experiment suddenly vanished from the loading docks. By late January, the camp was operating on the absolute margins of survival. Surviving quartermaster ledgers document a steep, alarming drop in daily caloric intake. The meat reserves were exhausted. Fuel oil for the base boilers was heavily rationed, and the daily menu was reduced to watery broths, hard crusts of military bread, and meager root vegetables. For the Italian auxiliary personnel, this sudden deprivation was the final psychological fracture. Shivering in their cots and stripped of legal recourse, they viewed the starvation rations as the ultimate American betrayal. Rumors of a coordinated, camp-wide labor strike swept through the compounds. If the women refused to man the industrial laundries and maintenance facilities, the surrounding regional training base, already operating at capacity, would rapidly grind to an administrative halt. Faced with the imminent collapse of the Texas experiment, the camp command teetered on the edge of a violent intervention. Sending armed military police into the freezing compounds to force compliance would shatter the politically fragile Italian Service Units program overnight. Instead, the administration made a desperate, unprecedented tactical gamble. They threw open the emergency depot reserves and handed complete logistical authority of the remaining base supplies over to the Italian kitchen personnel. What followed was not a gesture of goodwill, but a meticulously executed survival operation. Working alongside American supply sergeants, who were equally exhausted and freezing, the Italian women organized a massive, improvised culinary mobilization. They combined the last of the base's coarse Texas cornmeal, emergency lard rations, and whatever frozen vegetables could be salvaged from the regional root cellars. Applying relentless Mediterranean cooking techniques to salvage the substandard American ingredients, they engineered a massive, highly fortified communal meal. For the first time since the gates closed, the physical barriers between captor and detainee were deliberately suspended for an administrative purpose. In the drafty, unheated base mess hall, American guards, quartermasters and Italian female auxiliaries sat along the same wooden benches to consume the caloric yield of their joint labor. This shared distribution of hot, dense rations served as the decisive de-escalation event of the winter crisis. It immediately diffused the strike, restored the base's operational output, and stabilized the volatile compound without a single round being fired. Yet this critical turning point was not forged by a shared political ideology or a sudden realization of mutual friendship. It was dictated entirely by the cold, undeniable, practical mechanics of human survival. That shared meal in the drafty mess hall did not instantly erase the barbed wire, nor did it magically transform armed guards and displaced detainees into friends. Standard World War II textbooks rarely dedicate space to the sun-baked plains of the American Southwest. The grand, sweeping narratives of the conflict are almost exclusively dominated by the heroic beachheads of Europe, the sprawling naval armadas, and the massive armored clashes of the front line. In that colossal theater of combat, a single detention facility holding a fraction of auxiliary personnel seems like a microscopic footnote. Yet, the historical gravity of this isolated Texas camp lies precisely in its lack of cinematic glory. It serves as a stark, documented counter-narrative to the romanticized myths of wartime reconciliation. The transition of these women from hostile enemy agents to essential logistical co-workers was not sparked by a sudden, heartwarming realization of shared humanity. It was a slow, grueling, and highly calculated evolution, forced into existence by the unyielding, mechanized demands of a global war. The brutal realities of international conflict are not exclusively resolved by the grand strokes of fountain pens on surrender treaties in distant capital cities. As the bureaucratic paralysis and the winter crisis in Texas demonstrated, diplomatic agreements merely dictate a change in official policy. The actual execution of peace, the physical dismantling of deep-seated ideological hostility, is ultimately managed on the ground through rigid logistics, desperate legal maneuvering, and raw, daily necessity. The American quartermasters and the Italian personnel did not forge their uneasy alliance out of forgiveness. They did it because the sheer, unforgiving pressure of their environment demanded it. By stripping away the sentimentality and examining the cold, administrative facts buried in the ledgers of this dusty internment camp, we uncover a profound, unvarnished truth about conflict resolution. In the end, this forgotten chapter of World War II proves that true reconciliation between warring nations was never truly finalized by a diplomat's pen on a pristine treaty. Instead, the actual foundation for peace was hammered out in the freezing dark of a Texas winter, constructed strictly from logistical necessity, calculated calorie counts, and the desperate distribution of modified military rations. It remains a stark historical testament that when ideology crumbles and supply chains collapse, the brutal arithmetic of physical survival will inevitably force the bitterest of enemies to sit down at the exact same table.